From November 1945 to October 1946, the Nuremberg Trials took place, which retroactively arraigned Nazis for the crimes they committed in World War II. These trials protected the victims by retroactively identifying the rights that were violated and the crimes that were committed against them. In these trials, the Allied countries and the court had a responsibility to hold a fair trial and help serve justice. These trials impacted the victims of World War II by bringing the crimes committed to light and finally identifying their human rights. The long-term significance of these trials is that it provided a promise to the world that people would be protected under a safe law, inspiring more than 70 human rights treaties to be born. Before the Nuremberg trials, the world was fighting a war against the Nazis as the Holocaust raged on. From 1939 to 1945, the Nazis would target anyone who was Jewish or went against their beliefs. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet Union started to liberate camps such as Auschwitz. During this time, the world began to learn about the horrible treatment of the Jews. In 1942, four Allied countries, the American, British, French, and Soviet governments came together and declared their intent to stage a trial regarding the crimes committed against the Jews by the Nazis. Before the trial officially started, the International Military Tribunal, IMT, was created and the Nuremberg Charter was signed. The IMT allowed the Allied countries to prosecute and punish the criminals of the Holocaust. Each Allied country who was included in the IMT presented one main judge, an alternate judge, and a prosecution team. The Nuremberg Charter held the court accountable to hold a fair trial and define 3 crimes that were the main source of the trial. The trial started in November 1945, located in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. In these trials, those who played major roles in the Nazi rule were tried. These trials ended in October 1946. 19 out of the 24 defendants were convicted, with 12 defendants sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, and 4 to prison sentences from 10 to 20 years. These trials forever changed international law and protected the future of human rights. By bringing these crimes to light, the trials provided an international guard against anything of this relation happening in the future, showing that it would not be tolerated. In the Nuremberg trials, the human rights that were violated by the Nazis were retroactively identified and protected. One result of the trials was the establishment that a person could be held responsible for the violation of another human's right. Additionally, the trials established the idea that people have inherent dignity regardless of race, identity, culture, or gender. According to the Nuremberg trials, the National World War II Museum, it states, the jurisdiction of the tribunal included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The IMT defined crimes against humanity as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds. This evidence shows the crimes that the Nazis were held accountable for. The trial identified what had been done and named them as a violation of human rights. This solidified the idea that a person could be held accountable for the defiance of another human's right. Another piece of evidence is from film presented as evidence the Nazi plan. In the video, it images hateful actions of the Nazis taking and burning the German Jews' belongings. Additionally, the video shows footage of the Nazis encouraging the boycott of Jewish businesses and the public degradation of the Jewish people. These videos were used as evidence in the trials. They showed how the Nazis stripped the Jewish people of their right to have a unique identity. These video accounts showed the extreme discrimination against the Jews and many others who opposed the Nazis. By showing these crimes through video, it allowed the court to specifically identify the damages done. This identification helped the court to prosecute the violation of the Jews' inherent dignity and inspire future laws to protect their human rights. In the trials, the judges and prosecuting teams from the 4 Allied countries had the responsibility to hold a fair trial that would serve justice. This ensured that the trials retroactively secured the victims' rights that should have been protected. From the site, The Grave Responsibility of Justice, Justice Robert H. Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. This quote highlights the importance of the 4 Allied nations to bring about the prosecution of the crimes committed and set precedent for more specific human rights laws moving forward. The IMT had the direct responsibility to carry out the trial fairly and make final decisions about the prosecution of the accused. Another piece of evidence from the Nuremberg Trials and its legacy, the National World War II Museum, states, consequently, the most important legacies of the IMT were its punishment of the worst Nazi offenders, its irrefutable documentation of Nazi crimes, and its discrediting of the Nazi Party among most of the German population. These outcomes owed to the Western Allies' efforts to conduct fair trials and its widespread dissemination of news related to their outcome. This evidence reveals the IMT's responsibility to gather compelling evidence in order to prosecute the right people for the right things. By bringing to light the atrocities of the highest German officials and prosecuting them for their crimes, the Allied countries showed the world that crimes like this would not be tolerated. Additionally, it was the responsibility of the group to make sure that the news of the trial spread all over the world so things like this would not happen again. The immediate results of the Nuremberg trials impacted both the defendants and the victims of the Holocaust. According to Justice at Nuremberg, Harry S. Truman, on September 30th and October 1st, 1946, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment, 2 received 20 years imprisonment, 1 sentenced to 15 years, 1 to 10 years, and 3 defendants were found not guilty. One of the immediate impacts of the Nuremberg trials was the punishments of the accused. The main criminals were brought to justice, providing the Jewish victims closure and a chance to rebuild and start living their new lives. According to the Jewish response to the Nuremberg trials, it states, during the trials, Jews throughout Europe were beginning to rebuild what was left of their lives after the nefarious actions of the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trials, for some, were a way to finally put the past behind them and move on. For others, though, the trials became a point of contention and another disappointment in the way the world treated Jewish people. This evidence shows that the immediate impact of the trials was not all positive. For some people, the trials helped them move on with their lives, giving them a shield of safety and justice. For others, they were upset that the trials didn't go further by holding more people accountable. The main reactions to the trials were both good and bad. They either thought it was good what they were doing, or they thought it wasn't a just trial for everyone responsible. The Nuremberg trials have clearly had a long-term impact as well. One piece of evidence is again from The Grave Responsibility of Justice Robert H. Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg. In this site, he says, what makes this inquest significant is that these pioneers represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of arrogance and cruelty of power. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive. Justice Jackson shows with this quote the importance of keeping the Holocaust in the past. He also implies that no such thing should be repeated and that laws should be made to enforce that. Another piece of evidence from the Nuremberg trials and how they influence international criminal law from Jurist magazine states, from there on, it set an international standard for all people and all nations regarding human rights. Human rights are now defined as rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. They include right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, as well as the right to work and education, and many more. This quote shows how the Nuremberg trials established a standard for all human rights that is still held to this day internationally. This allows people with all sorts of differences to live a full life from the timeline of the Nuremberg trials to today. Further, people all over the U.S. have spoke their opinions of the similarities between Nazi action and those of the current administration. For example, a poster seen at recent protests says, if you ever have wondered what you do during slavery, the Holocaust, or civil rights movement, you're doing it right now. This relates to the Nuremberg trials because in the trials there was a promise that events like those done by the Nazis would never happen again. To this day, the atrocities of World War II are still being talked about. To have an event like the Nuremberg trials to bring to light those crimes and to keep things like that in the past is important. Plus, these trials have improved the international law system significantly. Now people are protected from crimes of the magnitude because laws protecting human rights are more widely established, helping to keep every person safe.